London is shrouded in fog. Where others see chaos, he finds the truth. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes is back. Welcome to the channel. Put on your headphones, like the video, and subscribe. Let's begin. It was upon an evening of early November, when the fog lay upon London like a living thing, that the case first intruded itself into our quiet rooms at Baker Street. I remember the hour with peculiar clarity, for Holmes had been in one of those rare moods of indolent abstraction which follow intense mental exertion. For 3 days, he had scarcely stirred from his armchair, save to replenish his pipe or pace the length of the sitting room with restless strides, his long fingers steepled beneath his hawk-like chin. No client had crossed our threshold, and yet I could see, from the glint in his eye and the half-formed murmurs which escaped him unawares, that his mind was far from idle. Outside, the city groaned and whispered beneath the yellow pall of the gas lamps. The rumble of hansom cabs was muffled, footsteps emerged and vanished like apparitions, and even the familiar cries of the street vendors seemed subdued, as though London herself held her breath. Mrs. Hudson had drawn the curtains early, and the fire burned low, casting long, wavering shadows upon the walls. I had been reading, though with little attention, when Holmes suddenly spoke. "You observe, Watson," said he without turning his head, "that the city is in a state of uncommon nervous tension." I laid my book aside. "I observe only the fog, Holmes, and your inclination to make pronouncements when there is no one to contradict you." He smiled faintly. "Ah, but contradiction is unnecessary when the facts speak plainly. The papers this morning were filled with it." "The papers are always filled with something alarming." "True, yet this time the alarm is justified." Before I could press him further, there came a sharp rap at the door below, quick, insistent, and followed by the sound of hurried voices. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps ascended with unusual haste. "A gentleman from Scotland Yard, Mr. Holmes," she announced, her face pale with excitement. "He says it is most urgent." Holmes was on his feet in an instant, the languor vanishing like mist before the sun. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson." Inspector Lestrade entered moments later, his coat damp with fog, his narrow face drawn into lines of fatigue and irritation. He nodded curtly to me and turned at once to Holmes. "I'll not waste words," said he. "We have a situation." Holmes gestured to the chair opposite him. "Then you had best use them wisely." Lestrade seated himself, removed his hat, and passed a hand over his thinning hair. "Another one, Mr. Holmes. Third in a fortnight." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "Another death?" "A murder," Lestrade replied grimly. "If murder it can be called. That's the trouble of it." I felt a chill which had nothing to do with the November air. "What do you mean?" "The man was found in his own house, doors locked, windows barred, no sign of entry or struggle. Stone dead." Holmes leaned forward. "Name?" "Edgar Lawson, clerk to a shipping firm in Limehouse. Quiet fellow, no enemies as far as we can tell." "And the cause of death?" "That is another difficulty," Lestrade said. "No wound, no poison we can identify, no mark upon the body save for a faint discoloration at the temples. The doctor is baffled." Holmes's fingers drummed softly upon the arm of his chair. "And the previous two?" Lestrade hesitated. "Much the same. Different men, different districts, same impossibility. Each alone, each locked in, each dead." A silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the fire. I saw Holmes's gaze drift, not to Lestrade, but to the far corner of the room, where the shadows gathered thickest. "You have searched for a connection between the victims," Holmes said at last. "We have," Lestrade replied, "and found none. Different trades, different habits, no shared acquaintances that we can trace. That is why—" He broke off, clearly reluctant. "That is why you have come to me," Holmes finished calmly. "Yes," said Lestrade. "The papers are already calling it the work of some phantom. The uncatchable man, they say. Public confidence is strained." Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. "The public has a talent for melodrama. Still, it is often closer to the truth than the police suppose." Lestrade bristled. "We have not been idle, Holmes. I do not suggest that you have, only that you may have been looking in the wrong direction." I could not help interjecting. "Holmes, do you truly believe these deaths are connected?" He turned to me. "Believe? No. I observe that the similarities are too precise to be accidental, and the differences too carefully arranged to be natural." Lestrade rose. "Then will you come and see the scene for yourself?" Holmes stood, reaching for his coat. "Of course. A locked room, an invisible hand, and a mind capable of arranging both. Such things are rarely dull." As we descended into the fog-choked street, I felt an unease settle upon me. A sense that we were stepping not merely into a new investigation, but into a contest of intellect unlike any we had faced before. Holmes walked briskly, his long figure swallowed and revealed by the swirling mist, while behind us the lamps of Baker Street faded into obscurity. I could not shake the feeling that somewhere in that vast, breathing city, a pair of eyes watched our departure with keen interest, and that our involvement had been anticipated long before Lestrade ever knocked upon our door. Our cab carried us eastward through streets that grew narrower and more sinister with every turning. The fog thickened as though resentful of intrusion, clinging to the lamps and curling about the wheels until even the driver slowed his pace, craning forward like a sailor in treacherous waters. Limehouse revealed itself reluctantly. Rows of darkened houses, shuttered shops, and the faint, briny odor of the river, mingling with cold smoke and decay. It was a quarter of London that never slept easily, haunted by sailors' tales, foreign tongues, and the ceaseless traffic of goods and men whose business prospered best in shadows. Lestrade directed us to a modest brick house set back from the street behind a low iron fence. A constable stood guard at the gate, stamping his feet against the cold. The windows were dark, the blinds drawn, giving the place the appearance of a skull with its eye sockets stopped. "This is it," said Lestrade. Lawson lived alone, respectable enough, paid his rent on time, no trouble with the neighbors. Holmes paused at the gate, his gaze sweeping the facade with an intensity that made me glance again, half expecting to see something I had missed. "Respectability," he murmured, "is often the most effective disguise." Inside, the air was close and carried a faint, unpleasant tang. Not quite decay, but something acrid and unfamiliar. A lamp had been lit in the front room, revealing a neatly kept space. A writing desk against one wall, shelves of account books, a small dining table with a single chair. Nothing appeared disturbed. "The body is upstairs," Lestrade said, "but you may wish to see this room first." Holmes nodded and began a slow circuit, his eyes darting from floor to ceiling. He knelt by the hearth, examined the poker, the tongs, the arrangement of ash. He crossed to the desk, opening drawers, sniffing at the ink bottle, touching the blotter with delicate fingers. "You have searched thoroughly?" Holmes asked. "As thoroughly as men can," Lestrade replied. "No sign of struggle, no weapon. Windows bolted from within, door locked, key on the inside of the victim's pocket." Holmes straightened. "And yet you say he died suddenly?" "Instantly, according to the doctor." "Doctors," Holmes said softly, "are excellent judges of symptoms, but poor readers of circumstances." We ascended the narrow staircase. The bedroom was small, almost austere. Lawson lay upon the bed, fully clothed, his hands folded upon his chest, as though arranged for burial. His face was calm, almost serene, save for a curious darkening at the temples, symmetrical on either side. I confess the sight disturbed me deeply. Death had visited many forms upon my old battlefields, yet this orderly stillness, this absence of violence, was unsettling in a way I could scarcely articulate. Holmes stood at the foot of the bed, silent for a long moment. Then he leaned closer, peering at the discoloration. "May I?" he asked the constable. At a nod, Holmes gently tilted the man's head, examining the ears, the hairline, the skin beneath the collar. He sniffed, then straightened abruptly. "You perceive nothing unusual?" he asked Lestrade. "Nothing we can act upon," Lestrade replied. "If you see poison, name it. If you see a weapon, show it to me." Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he moved to the window, testing the latch, the bars. He opened the wardrobe, inspected the boots beneath the bed, ran his fingers along the skirting board. "Watson," he said suddenly, "what strikes you most about this room?" I considered. "Its orderliness. The man appears to have retired for the night without alarm." "Precisely. And yet—" Holmes gestured toward the body. Death came to him unbidden. No cry heard by neighbors. No sign of intrusion. No evident cause. "Then you believe—" I hesitated. "I believe," Holmes said carefully, "that what killed Edgar Lawson left no mark because it did not need to." Lestrade scoffed. "That sounds like philosophy, not police work." Holmes smiled thinly. "Philosophy is merely observation refined." He returned to the bedside and withdrew a small lens from his pocket. "Doctor's report?" "Heart failure," Lestrade said. "But the man was 35 and healthy." Holmes nodded. A convenient conclusion. He stepped back, surveying the room once more, then addressed Lestrade. "Tell me about the other two." "Henry Wilcox, a tobacconist in Clerkenwell. Samuel Brigg, a schoolmaster in Camberwell. Similar circumstances. Each alone. Each secure. Each dead without warning. No connection in their habits. None that stands out." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And yet you persist." "Because 3 impossibilities make a pattern," Lestrade admitted reluctantly. Holmes turned to me as we descended the stairs once more. "Watson, note the smell in this house." I inhaled. "I smell only damp and coal smoke." "And something else," Holmes insisted. "Faint, acrid. It clings to the curtains, the bedding, not strong enough to be noticed by men who do not expect it." "You think it's significant?" "I think," Holmes replied, "that it is the first honest thing this house has told us." Outside, the fog pressed close, as though eager to swallow the grim little building whole. As we departed, I glanced back and saw the constable shutting the door with exaggerated care, locking away the secret within. Holmes remained silent during the drive back, his gaze fixed upon the shifting gloom beyond the window. At last, he spoke. "Our adversary," he said, "is not merely careful, he is theatrical." "Theatrical," I echoed. "He stages death as a performance, controlled, precise, and devoid of the messiness that betrays human error." "And you believe this will continue?" Holmes's expression hardened. "Unless we interrupt the performance, Watson, the curtain will rise again." The words lingered with me long after we returned to Baker Street, and as I lay awake that night, listening to the distant murmurs of the city, I could not shake the dread that somewhere, unseen and unchallenged, the uncatchable man prepared his next act. The morning that followed our visit to Limehouse dawned raw and colourless, the fog lifting only enough to reveal a sky of dull pewter. Holmes was awake before me, as I discovered upon descending to the sitting room, where he sat surrounded by an array of newspapers, police reports, and his own meticulous notes. His pipe lay cold beside him, untouched, which alone was sufficient to tell me that his mind was fully engaged elsewhere. "You have not slept," I observed. "Sleep," Holmes replied without looking up, "is a concession to mental exhaustion. I am not yet exhausted." He slid a newspaper across the table. The headline leapt out at once. "Mysterious Third Death. London baffled by locked-room murders." Below it, the prose indulged in speculation of the wildest sort. Foreign assassins, secret societies, even supernatural agency. Holmes snorted softly. "The press," said he, "is a mirror that magnifies ignorance." "And yet," I said, "they have captured the public imagination. The phrase, 'the uncatchable man,' is already taking root." "Indeed, which is precisely what our killer desires." That assertion startled me. "You think he courts publicity?" "Not directly. He courts confusion. The name suggests inevitability, invincibility. Once men believe a thing cannot be caught, they cease to look closely." Holmes rose and began pacing, hands clasped behind his back. 3 deaths, 3 different boroughs, 3 men of no apparent importance. And yet the similarities are too exact. "You spoke last night of theatre," I reminded him. "Do you truly believe the murders are staged for effect?" "I believe," Holmes said, "that the murderer understands the psychology of investigators. He gives them an impossibility and watches them flounder." At that moment there came a knock at the door, less urgent than Lestrade's had been, but persistent. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a thin, nervous man with ink-stained fingers and a clerk's stoop. "This is Mr. Harold Fenwick," she said. "He says he has information about the Limehouse case." Fenwick wrung his hat in his hands. "I did not wish to trouble the police, sir," he said to Holmes, "but I read in the paper that you were involved." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "You did well to come. Speak freely." "I worked with Lawson," Fenwick began, "at the shipping office. We were not close friends, but I knew his habits." "And those habits were?" Holmes prompted. "He was methodical, always punctual, never drank, never gambled. But lately," Fenwick hesitated. "Lately," Holmes pressed, "he had been distracted. Once or twice he complained of headaches, said the air in the office bothered him." Holmes's eyes flickered briefly toward me, then back to Fenwick. "Did he mention anyone troubling him?" "No, sir, but he did receive letters." "What sort of letters?" "Plain envelopes, no return address. He never showed them to anyone. After reading them, he would go quite pale." Lestrade's words echoed in my mind. No enemies as far as we can tell. Holmes leaned forward. Did you see one of these letters? Only the envelope, sir. Once, when he dropped it. The paper was thick, expensive. Thank you, Holmes said. You may have rendered a great service. After Fenwick departed, Holmes resumed his pacing. Letters, I mused. Threats, perhaps. Or instructions, Holmes replied. Or something subtler still. You believe Lawson was not chosen at random. On the contrary, Watson, I believe he was chosen precisely because he appeared random. Holmes turned to his desk and pulled out a map of London, already marked with pins. 3 red ones indicated the sites of the murders. Observe, he said, the distances. No clear geographic logic, yet each lies within reasonable reach of the river. A coincidence? Possibly, but coincidences should be treated as suspects. Before I could respond, another knock sounded. This time it was Lestrade himself, looking more harried than ever. We have another development, he announced. A witness of sorts. He explained that in Camberwell, on the night of Briggs' death, a neighbour had reported a strange odour seeping through the walls, sharp, metallic, gone by morning. Holmes's gaze sharpened. An odour is a footprint the killer cannot help but leave, he said. You said something similar at Limehouse, I recalled. Yes, and now it repeats. Lestrade frowned. You have a theory? I have several, Holmes replied, all unsatisfactory. Meaning? Meaning that the true one has not yet declared itself. That evening, Holmes insisted we revisit Clerkenwell. The tobacconist's shop was closed, its windows dark, but the proprietor's rooms above remained under guard. Holmes questioned neighbours, inspected vents, chimneys, drains. Everywhere, the same faint suggestion of that acrid tang, lingering like a ghost. As we walked back through the lamplit streets, I ventured, Holmes, do you believe the killer uses some form of gas? Holmes did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was measured. I believe he wishes us to believe so. A red herring? Perhaps. Or perhaps the truth wearing a mask. He halted abruptly beneath a street lamp. Watson, consider this. What is more terrifying, a weapon we can name or one we cannot? The unknown, I said. Just so. Our killer trades in uncertainty. We returned to Baker Street with more questions than answers. Holmes sat long into the night, scribbling notes, crossing them out, pacing, pausing to stare into the fire. At last he spoke, almost to himself. He is daring us to misunderstand him. And what happens, I asked quietly, if we accept the dare? Holmes looked up, his eyes grave. Then we will continue to chase shadows while he perfects his art. The fire crackled softly, and outside the fog closed in once more. I felt then, with growing certainty, that the uncatchable man was not merely killing individuals, but constructing a labyrinth of false logic, one in which even Sherlock Holmes must tread with care, lest brilliance itself become a liability. The days that followed were marked by a peculiar tension, as though the very air of London vibrated with expectation. Holmes became increasingly methodical, rising early to consult chemical treatises, medical journals, and obscure monographs, whose titles alone were enough to test my patience. He sent notes to acquaintances at hospitals and laboratories, received replies in sealed envelopes, and spent hours conducting small experiments whose purposes he did not trouble to explain. I observed all this with a mixture of admiration and unease. Holmes was never more formidable than when confronting the unknown. Yet there was about him now a restraint, a carefulness that I had seldom seen. It was as though he sensed that a single misstep might render the entire puzzle insoluble. On the fourth morning after the Limehouse investigation, Holmes handed me a cup of coffee and said, "Watson, tell me, what do you know of fear?" I nearly spilled the cup. Fear? I should say I know it well enough, having faced it in less comfortable circumstances than Baker Street. Indeed, Holmes replied, but I do not mean fear as an emotion. I mean fear as a tool. I frowned. You believe the killer employs it deliberately? I believe, Holmes said, that fear is the principal instrument of this crime and death merely its consequence. He spread several documents upon the table. Consider this. 3 men, each leading orderly, predictable lives. Each begins to experience unease, headaches, distraction, nervousness. Each receives letters or notices some disturbance in his environment. And then, at the moment of greatest vulnerability, death occurs. Swiftly, silently. You suggest that the victims were prepared, I said slowly. Conditioned, perhaps. Holmes's eyes flickered with approval. An excellent word. Before I could pursue the thought, there came a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor. Dr. Percival Hume, a lecturer in physiology at King's College, whom Holmes had consulted on prior occasions. Hume was a stout man with thoughtful eyes and an air of cautious curiosity. After the customary greetings, Holmes wasted no time. "Doctor," he said, "I wish to know whether fear alone can kill." Hume raised his brows. Fear can precipitate many conditions: cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, particularly in those predisposed. And in a healthy man of 35? Rare, Hume admitted, but not impossible. Holmes nodded. And could such a death leave little physical trace? Yes, especially if the precipitating stimulus was subtle. What form might such a stimulus take? Holmes pressed. Hume hesitated. Sensory triggers, perhaps. Certain sounds, odors. In extreme cases, suggestion alone. Holmes thanked him and saw him out, leaving me to digest the implications. "You think the killer frightens his victims to death?" I said at last. "I think," Holmes replied, "that he creates conditions under which death becomes the victim's own doing." That afternoon brought fresh news from Lestrade. Another letter had been discovered, this time among Briggs' effects. It was brief, written in an elegant hand, and contained only a single sentence. "You will understand when it is time." No signature, no threat, nothing overtly sinister. A message designed to linger, Holmes observed, to gnaw. Lestrade was less philosophical. "We are no closer to an arrest." "On the contrary," Holmes said, "we are very close to the edge of a misinterpretation." He explained his concern to me later, once Lestrade had gone. "The danger, Watson, lies in assuming the killer employs a single method. Gas, poison, suggestion. These are all plausible. But plausibility is his camouflage. You believe there is a simpler explanation. I believe there is a more elegant one." That evening, Holmes insisted upon a walk through Bloomsbury, ostensibly to clear his head. The streets were lively despite the hour, the fog thinner here, the glow of lamps reflected in wet cobblestones. As we passed a narrow alley, Holmes paused abruptly. "Do you smell that?" he asked. I inhaled. Only tobacco smoke. And beneath it, I sniffed again. Something sharp, metallic. Holmes smiled faintly. "Exactly." He led me down the alley to a small workshop, its its door ajar. Inside, a man was cleaning brass instruments, whistles, pipes, curious contraptions of polished metal. "A maker of instruments," Holmes murmured. "Acoustic, by the look of it." "You think sound plays a role?" I asked. "I think," Holmes replied, "that sound is among the most underestimated of stimuli." We did not enter, but the encounter lodged itself in my mind. As we walked on, Holmes spoke at length about resonance, vibration, and the physiological effects of certain frequencies, how they could induce discomfort, panic, even unconsciousness. "You are suggesting," I said incredulously, "that the killer uses sound as a weapon." "I suggest nothing yet," Holmes said. "I observe that the idea unsettles you. That alone makes it valuable." The next day brought another death. This time the victim was a woman, Mrs. Eleanor Pike, a seamstress in Southwark. The circumstances were hauntingly familiar. Alone, locked in, no sign of struggle. Yet there was a difference that immediately caught Holmes's attention. She lived above her shop, Lestrade explained, with the street directly below. Holmes examined the room, then the window, then the narrow staircase. "Watson," he said softly, "note the proximity." "To what?" I asked. "To the world," Holmes replied. "Sound carries upward." Mrs. Pike's neighbours reported hearing nothing unusual, no cry, no struggle. But one mentioned a faint humming, like the distant vibration of machinery that had persisted late into the night. As we returned to Baker Street, Holmes was silent, his expression grim. "The pattern is shifting," I ventured. "No," Holmes said, "it is revealing itself." Yet for all this, he remained cautious, unwilling to commit to a single theory. He warned Lestrade against premature conclusions, urged patience, restraint. "Why such hesitation?" I asked him that night. "Because," Holmes replied, "our adversary is watching, and the moment we announce our certainty, he will adapt." I lay awake long after Holmes had retired, my mind replaying the events of the day. The locked rooms, the subtle clues, the growing sense that the murders were not merely acts of violence, but experiments. And I could not escape the chilling thought that, in studying the science of fear, the uncatchable man had found a way to turn the human mind itself into the deadliest of weapons, one that left no fingerprints and offered no resistance until it was far too late. The death of Mrs. Pike marked a subtle yet unmistakable turning of the tide. Where before the murders had stirred curiosity and alarm in equal measure, they now bred something darker, a pervasive anxiety that crept into drawing rooms and lodging houses alike. Women whispered of bolting doors earlier, men lingered uneasily before extinguishing lamps, and even the bravest among them confessed to starting at the most ordinary of sounds. London, that great organism of noise and motion, had begun to listen to itself with suspicion. Holmes, for his part, responded not with haste, but with a tightening of method. He declined several invitations from Lestrade to accompany him to further examinations, choosing instead to remain at Baker Street, where he devoted himself to an exhaustive analysis of the correspondence connected to the victim. Fenwick's mention of the letters had clearly struck a chord, and Holmes now pursued that slender thread with relentless focus. They are the only deliberate contact between the killer and his victims, Holmes said to me one morning as he arranged a series of envelopes upon the table. Everything else is environmental. Conditions created, stimuli introduced, opportunities exploited. but the letters are personal. You believe they are essential to the act? I asked. Essential to the preparation, Holmes replied. Without them, the victims might have resisted or at least questioned. With them, they are primed. He handed me a magnifying lens. Observe the paper. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, thick, cream-colored, smooth to the touch. But under closer inspection, I detected a faint watermark, barely perceptible unless held at a precise angle. Expensive stationery, I noted. Yes, and uncommon, manufactured in small batches, often to order. You think the killer wishes to be noticed? No, Holmes said. He wishes to be remembered. He turned his attention to the ink. Chemical composition consistent across all letters, yet the handwriting varies slightly. Multiple writers? I ventured. One writer, Holmes corrected, with a studied inconsistency, a deliberate imperfection. That afternoon, Holmes dispatched me on a series of errands, visiting stationers, printers, and suppliers across the city. I returned weary but enlightened, bearing lists of names and addresses. Holmes compared them against his own records, eliminating possibilities with ruthless efficiency. There, he said at last, tapping a name. A small firm in Holborn. They supply bespoke stationery to private clients. We visited the premises the following day. The proprietor, a nervous man with ink-stained cuffs, confirmed that several orders matching Holmes's description had been placed over the past year. Always paid in cash, the man said. Always collected in person. Can you describe the customer? Holmes asked. The man hesitated. He was unremarkable, middle height, plain clothes. I remember him only because I cannot remember him. Holmes nodded, unsurprised. Did he ever give a name? No, sir. As we left, Holmes was thoughtful. Anonymity as an art form, he murmured. That evening, Lestrade arrived with troubling news. Another letter had surfaced, this time intercepted before delivery. It bore no address, no stamp, only a name written with careful precision. Who is the intended recipient? Holmes asked. Lestrade swallowed. A Mr. Jonathan Reeves lives in Islington. And is he alive? For now. Holmes was on his feet at once. Then we have, at last, an opportunity. We reached Reeves's house shortly after nightfall. It was a narrow terrace, modest but well kept. Reeves himself proved to be a pale, anxious man, visibly shaken by the police presence. I have done nothing, he insisted. I swear it. We do not accuse you, Holmes said gently. We wish to protect you. The letter lay unopened upon the table. Holmes examined it, then handed it to Reeves. Read it, he said. Reeves broke the seal with trembling fingers. You are closer than you think. Nothing more. Reeves's face drained of color. What does it mean? Holmes watched him intently. Tell me, Mr. Reeves, have you noticed anything unusual of late? Sounds, smells, sensations? Reeves hesitated, then nodded. At night, there is a vibration, a hum. I thought it was the pipes. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Do not remain here tonight, Holmes said firmly. Pack what you need and come with us. Reeves obeyed without protest. As we escorted him into the street, I felt a curious sensation, a prickle at the base of my skull, as though something unseen had shifted its attention. Back at Baker Street, Holmes installed Reeves in the spare room and set about arranging a watch. He placed glasses against the walls, set up small mechanical devices of his own design, and instructed me to remain alert. If our adversary is as confident as I believe, Holmes said quietly. He will not be deterred by police presence alone. The night wore on. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the clock and the occasional murmur of traffic beyond the fog. Then, shortly after midnight, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic vibration, barely audible, yet impossible to ignore once perceived. Holmes's eyes snapped open. He held up a hand for silence. The hum grew stronger, resonating through the walls, setting the glassware trembling. "There," Holmes whispered. "You hear it now." "Yes," I said, my heart pounding. "What is it?" Holmes did not answer. Instead, he moved swiftly to the window and peered out into the street below. "Watson," he said, his voice low and urgent, "our killer has just made his boldest move yet." As the vibration intensified, I realized with a sudden chill that the uncatchable man was no longer content to operate in shadows. He had come, unannounced and unseen, to the very threshold of our lives, and whatever mechanism he employed, it was already in motion. The vibration persisted for several minutes, rising and falling with an irregular rhythm that defied immediate explanation. It was not loud, yet it possessed a penetrating quality, insinuating itself into the bones rather than the ears. I felt it in my chest, a faint tightening of the breath, a subtle unease that sharpened the senses and frayed the nerves. Jonathan Reeves, roused from uneasy sleep, emerged from his room with a face pale as parchment. "What is that sound?" he whispered. Holmes did not answer at once. He had pressed his ear to the wall, one hand resting lightly upon the plaster, as though feeling for a pulse. His expression was intent, almost fierce, but controlled. "Remain still," he said at last. "And above all, remain calm." The hum wavered, dipped, then returned stronger than before. Glasses on the mantel chimed softly. The flame of the lamp flickered, though there was no draught. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, not painful, but distinctly uncomfortable. "This is no ordinary noise," I said under my breath. "No," Holmes replied. "It is quite deliberate." He crossed the room and opened the window a fraction. The fog pressed eagerly against the gap, but the sound did not diminish. If anything, it sharpened. "Below us," Holmes murmured, "somewhere very near." I leaned out beside him. Baker Street lay quiet, the lamps haloed in mist, the cobblestones slick with damp. A hansom stood idle at the corner, its driver hunched and motionless. Nothing else stirred. Suddenly, as abruptly as it had begun, the vibration ceased. The silence that followed was almost oppressive. Reeves let out a shaky breath. "Is it over?" he asked. "For now," Holmes said. "But you perceive its effect." Reeves nodded miserably. I felt as though something were tightening around me, as though if it continued, I might panic. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And if you had been alone? If you had already been made anxious by weeks of suggestion?" Reeves said nothing, but the answer was evident in his face. Holmes dismissed him gently back to his room and turned to me. "You see now, Watson," he said. "Not a weapon in the conventional sense, but a stimulus, one that exploits the body's own responses. You believe this hum killed the others?" "I believe it was one component," Holmes replied. "Fear does the rest." "But how is it produced?" I asked. "And from where?" "That," Holmes said, "is the question upon which everything hinges." The following morning, Holmes and I retraced the street with painstaking care. He examined drains, cellars, lampposts, and abandoned carts. He questioned shopkeepers, porters, and constables, extracting scraps of information with his customary ease. At last, we discovered a small cellar beneath an unoccupied shop 2 doors down from Baker Street. The door was locked, but the lock itself bore faint scratches, as though frequently opened and closed. Inside, the space was bare save for a curious apparatus. A metal frame, a series of pipes and diaphragms, and a hand-cranked mechanism designed to produce sustained vibrations. Holmes crouched beside it, his eyes alight. "A portable resonance device," he said. "Ingenious, crude in appearance, but effective." "Who could have built this?" I asked. "Someone with mechanical skill and a knowledge of acoustics," Holmes replied. "And, more importantly, someone who understands human psychology." Lestrade arrived shortly thereafter, his face grim. "We found no one," he said. "Whoever set this up was gone before dawn." "Of course," Holmes said. "He would not linger." Lestrade eyed the device. "So, this is how he does it." "This is how he unsettles," Holmes corrected. "The killing occurs within the victim." Lestrade shook his head. "Try explaining that to a jury." Holmes's expression grew serious. "Which is why he believes himself uncatchable." In the days that followed, Holmes devoted himself to tracing the origins of the device. He visited workshops, consulted engineers, and pored over patents. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, not of a single mastermind operating in isolation, but of a man who moved freely among tradesmen and intellectual circles, acquiring knowledge piecemeal, leaving no lasting impression. "He is a collector," Holmes observed, "of skills, of ideas, of methods. He assembles them into something new." "And the letters?" I asked. "Psychological priming," Holmes said. "The hum merely pushes the victim over the edge." Another letter arrived 2 days later. This one was addressed not to a prospective victim, but to Scotland Yard itself. "You are listening now. Soon you will understand." Lestrade was furious. "He is mocking us." "Yes," Holmes said quietly, and revealing his confidence. That night, Holmes made a decision that troubled me. "We shall set a trap," he said. "For whom?" I asked. "For him," Holmes replied, "by doing precisely what he expects." He explained his plan: to allow word to spread, carefully, subtly, that the police had identified the device and believed it to be the sole cause of death. The implication would be clear: remove the device and the danger ends. "He will not be able to resist correcting us," Holmes said. "For a man who prides himself on control, misunderstanding is intolerable." I admired Holmes's audacity, yet could not banish my unease. To bait such a mind seemed perilous. The trap was set. Rumors circulated. Articles appeared. Confidence returned tentatively to the streets. And then, as Holmes had predicted, the killer responded. A new death occurred, not in a locked room, but in the open air. The victim collapsed in a crowded market, surrounded by witnesses, with no hum, no device, no apparent cause. Panic spread like wildfire. Holmes read the report in silence, then folded the paper. "He has changed the rules," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "He has shown us that the rules were never what we thought." I saw then, with growing dread, that we were no longer merely pursuing a murderer. We were engaged in a battle against a philosophy, a method of killing that could adapt, evolve, and strike wherever fear could take root. And somewhere in London, the uncatchable man was listening, not for footsteps or sirens, but for the moment when even Sherlock Holmes would doubt his own understanding. The market at Seven Dials was, under ordinary circumstances, one of the liveliest corners of London, a place where noise, colour and human press combined to banish any sense of isolation. That such a place should now be associated with terror seemed almost obscene. Holmes insisted that we visit it at once, and so, accompanied by Lestrade, we made our way through streets already buzzing with rumour and exaggeration. The scene itself bore little resemblance to the locked, silent chambers we had grown accustomed to. The victim, a man named Arthur Cole, had been a porter by trade. He fell, according to witnesses, in the midst of bargaining for apples. One moment he was standing, laughing at some jest. The next he staggered, clutched at his chest, and collapsed. No strange sound preceded the fall. No odour lingered. No letter was found upon his person. And yet, Lestrade said, gesturing about us, half the market claims to have felt something. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Felt? A chill, a pressure, a sense that something was wrong, Lestrade replied. Useless testimony, of course. On the contrary, Holmes said softly, it is precisely the testimony we require. He questioned the witnesses himself, moving from stall to stall, drawing out their impressions with gentle persistence. One woman spoke of a sudden dizziness, another of a ringing in her ears, a third of an inexplicable dread that had seized her moments before the man fell. No common physical cause, I observed afterward. No, Holmes agreed, but a common psychological environment. You think the killer exploited the crowd? I think, Holmes said, that he exploited expectation. He explained further as we walked. The market had been saturated with fear in the days leading up to the death. Every cough, every stumble, every unusual sound had taken on sinister significance. Into such an atmosphere, no elaborate mechanism was required. A spark in a room filled with gas, Holmes said. The gas need not be visible. Lestrade was unconvinced. You cannot arrest a man for spreading fear. No, Holmes replied, but you can arrest him for murder. The difficulty, of course, lay in proving the connection. Without a device, without a letter, without a controlled environment, the case threatened to dissolve into speculation. That evening, Holmes returned to Baker Street in an unusually contemplative mood. He spoke little, ate less, and spent long periods staring into the fire. You doubt yourself, I said at last. Holmes looked up sharply. I reassess myself. There is a difference. All the difference in the world, Holmes replied. But I will admit this much. Our adversary has forced the contest onto unfamiliar ground. Does that trouble you? It invigorates me, Holmes said, but it also demands caution. The next clue came from an unexpected quarter. Mrs. Hudson, who had been following the case with keen interest, mentioned in passing that a former lodger had written to her, an odd fellow who had stayed briefly the previous year and left without notice. He was always polite, Mr. Holmes, she said, but there was something unsettling about him. He asked such peculiar questions about the walls, the pipes, the way sound travelled. Holmes's attention sharpened instantly. Did he give a name? He signed the register as Mr. Grant. Did he receive letters? Holmes asked. Yes, many. Holmes asked to see the register. The handwriting was neat, restrained, and instantly familiar. The same hand, Holmes murmured. Or rather, the same studied inconsistency. We traced Mr. Grant through several lodging houses, each time finding the same pattern. Short stays, polite manners, Odd questions, letters received and destroyed, always gone before suspicion could form. He uses London as a laboratory, I said. Yes, Holmes replied, and lodging houses as his test chambers. Lestrade secured descriptions from landlords and landladies, but they were maddeningly vague. Middle height, plain face, unremarkable. A man who understands the value of being overlooked, Holmes said. Days passed without another death, and the lull bred its own anxiety. Holmes used the time to reconstruct the killer's movements, mapping lodging houses, workshops, markets, and victims' residences. "Observe," he said one night, indicating a cluster of points on the map. "He is circling something." "What?" I asked. "Not a place," Holmes replied. "An idea." Before he could elaborate, a telegram arrived. Another letter had been delivered, this time to Holmes himself. It contained only 4 words: "You are not immune." I confess that a chill ran through me. Holmes, however, smiled faintly. "He acknowledges me at last," he said, "which means he believes himself my equal." "Is he?" I asked quietly. Holmes folded the letter with care. "He is clever, resourceful, and dangerously imaginative. But he has made a mistake." "What mistake?" "He has revealed his need for recognition," Holmes replied. "And that, Watson, is the one vulnerability no intellect can entirely conceal." That night, as I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of Baker Street, I felt the weight of the struggle pressing ever closer. The killer had demonstrated that he could strike anywhere, without apparatus, without warning. He had shown that fear itself could be weaponized on a grand scale. Yet Holmes seemed invigorated rather than daunted. He paced the sitting room long after midnight, muttering fragments of thought, testing hypotheses aloud, discarding them just as swiftly. At last, he paused before the window, gazing out into the fog. "He believes himself uncatchable because he thinks the crime is invisible," Holmes said. "But invisibility is not the same as absence." I joined him there, peering into the mist that swallowed the street below. "And when you find him?" I asked. Holmes's expression hardened. "Then London will learn that even the most elusive killer leaves a trail, not of footprints, but of ideas. And ideas, Watson, are far easier to follow than men." Even as he spoke, I sensed that the most dangerous phase of the contest lay ahead. The uncatchable man had cast aside his most obvious tools, embracing chaos itself as his ally. And in doing so, he had drawn Sherlock Holmes into a realm where intellect alone might not suffice, where the human mind, in all its brilliance and fragility, was both the battleground and the prize. In the aftermath of the market death, London entered a state of uneasy suspension. There were no fresh murders for several days, yet the absence of action did nothing to soothe the public. On the contrary, fear, once awakened, proved remarkably self-sustaining. People avoided crowds, then avoided solitude, mistrusting both equally. Ordinary noises, a whistle, a clattering cart, the distant thrum of machinery, took on an ominous significance. The killer, invisible and seemingly omnipresent, had succeeded in turning the city itself into an accomplice. Holmes observed these developments with a keen, almost clinical interest. "You see, Watson," he remarked one evening, as we watched pedestrians hurry past Baker Street with collars raised and eyes averted, "he has expanded the crime scene. It is no longer a room, a house, or a street. It is London." "And how does one police a city's state of mind?" I asked. "One does not," Holmes replied. "One studies it." He began by doing something that surprised me greatly. He immersed himself in the routine life of the city. He attended lectures, visited clubs, loitered in coffee houses, and struck up conversations with strangers of every class. I accompanied him often, recording impressions, noting patterns, though the purpose of these excursions was not immediately apparent to me. Gradually, however, a theme emerged. Everywhere we went, Holmes listened less for facts than for beliefs. "They think," Holmes said after one such outing, "that the killer can strike anyone, anywhere, at any time." "That belief seems justified," I said. "It seems so," Holmes agreed, "which is precisely why it is misleading." He explained his reasoning one night as we sat over a late supper. "Fear without structure is chaos," Holmes said. "But fear with structure becomes predictable. Our adversary has created a narrative, one in which he is omnipotent. But even omnipotence, if performed, must follow a script." "You believe he still chooses his victims deliberately?" I said. "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied. "The appearance of randomness is itself an affectation." Holmes returned to the map he had been refining, now annotated not merely with locations, but with notes on the victims' temperaments, routines, and recent anxieties. "Observe," he said, pointing with his long finger. Each victim, before death, exhibited heightened suggestibility. They were not merely afraid, they were receptive. "To what?" I asked. "To the idea that something was wrong with them," Holmes replied, "that they were vulnerable." "And how did he know this?" I pressed. Holmes smiled thinly. "By testing." He showed me reports of individuals who had received letters similar to those found among the victims' effects, but who had not died. Men and women who had grown anxious, altered their habits, sought medical advice, or even fled the city. "He experiments," Holmes said. "He observes who responds and how strongly. And those who respond most strongly become his victims," I concluded. "Precisely." The realization was chilling. The killer was not merely murdering, he was conducting a series of psychological trials, refining his technique with each iteration. "Then the market death?" I asked. "That man received no letter." "No," Holmes agreed. "But he lived and worked in an environment saturated with fear. He was a control case, proof that the broader atmosphere could suffice." Lestrade, when presented with these conclusions, was troubled. "You are describing a madman," he said. "No," Holmes corrected. "A rational man with an immoral objective." The distinction was not comforting. Another breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A young medical student who attended one of Holmes's lectures on observation. He approached Holmes afterward, hesitantly, and spoke of a paper he had read on mass psychogenic illness, cases where fear and expectation alone had produced genuine physical symptoms, even death. Holmes listened intently, then requested the paper at once. "This aligns neatly," he said to me later. "Our killer is exploiting well-documented phenomena, but applying them with unprecedented precision." "Can such a thing truly be directed?" I asked. "Only by someone who understands both medicine and human nature," Holmes replied. That night, Holmes received another letter. This one was different. It was longer, written in the same careful hand, and addressed him directly. "You seek to map my actions as though they were streets and buildings. You are mistaken. My territory is not space, but expectation. You will never catch me because there is nowhere to stand." Holmes read it twice, then placed it carefully in his notebook. "He grows impatient," Holmes said, "and philosophical." "That troubles you?" I asked. "It pleases me," Holmes replied. "Men reveal more when they sermonize." "What do you infer?" "That he believes himself untouchable because he believes the crime resides entirely within the victim," Holmes said. "Which means he underestimates the degree to which he himself must intervene." "How so?" "Letters must be written, observations must be made, devices must be placed, even if only temporarily. Presence is required, Watson, however fleeting." The challenge, then, was to predict that presence. Holmes began to frequent the lodging houses where the killer had once stayed, speaking casually with landlords, observing current tenants. He watched who asked questions, who lingered near walls, who listened rather than spoke. "You see," he explained, "imitation is inevitable. The killer's notoriety inspires others to emulate his mannerisms. We must distinguish copy from original." This task proved maddeningly difficult. For every genuine oddity, there were a dozen pretenders, men eager to feel important, to flirt with danger. Yet Holmes persisted. Late one night, as we returned from such an excursion, Holmes halted abruptly. "Watson," he said, "we are being observed." I felt my pulse quicken. "Where?" "Not behind us," Holmes replied. "Ahead." A man stood beneath a lamp some distance down the street, his face indistinct in the haze. He appeared to be waiting, though for what or whom was unclear. Holmes did not slow his pace. As we approached, the man stepped aside, allowing us to pass without a word. Yet, as I glanced back, he had vanished. "Did you recognize him?" I asked. "No," Holmes said, "but he recognized me." The encounter left me unsettled. It was the first time I felt that the invisible boundary between hunter and hunted had grown thin. That night, Holmes wrote late into the small hours, composing what he termed a counter-narrative, a theory not of how the crimes were committed, but of why. "He is not content merely to kill," Holmes said. "He wishes to demonstrate something." "What?" I asked. "That the mind is the ultimate crime scene," Holmes replied, "and that once one learns to control expectation, morality becomes irrelevant." I shuddered at the implication. "And you?" I asked. "What do you wish to demonstrate?" Holmes looked up from his writing, his eyes bright and unwavering. "That no man, however clever, can remove himself entirely from consequence," he said, "even if his footprints are thoughts." As I retired that night, I could not escape the sense that the case had reached a critical juncture. The killer had expanded his reach to the abstract realm of belief, while Holmes had resolved to pursue him there. The battle was no longer one of physical clues alone, but of ideas, assumptions, and the fragile architecture of human certainty. And somewhere in London, the uncatchable man was adjusting his calculations, preparing, no doubt, for a demonstration meant to prove, once and for all, that the geography of the mind had no borders at all. The days following Holmes's unsettling encounter beneath a street lamp were marked by a curious restraint on both sides of the contest. No fresh deaths occurred, yet the tension did not abate. Rather, it deepened, acquiring a sharper edge. Holmes spoke little of the man we had seen, but I noticed that his habits subtly altered. He varied his routes through the city, lingered unexpectedly in public places, and occasionally paused mid-conversation, his attention fixed upon some distant sound or movement that escaped my notice. "He is studying you as closely as you study him," I remarked one evening. Holmes inclined his head. "Which means he has entered the most dangerous phase of his design." "How so?" "When an experimenter grows impatient, Watson, he alters the conditions. The alteration came sooner than I expected. It began with a letter delivered not to a private residence, nor to the Yard, but to a public institution, St. Bartholomew's Hospital. The letter was addressed to the senior physician and contained a chilling proposal, though proposal was perhaps too gentle a word. You believe fear may kill. I propose to demonstrate the limits of your belief. The letter specified a time, a ward, and a patient. A man already weakened by illness, whose death could easily be attributed to natural causes. The implication was unmistakable. The killer intended to conduct a controlled experiment under medical observation. Lestrade was incandescent with fury. He is inviting us to watch him commit murder. Holmes was calm, almost serene. No, he's inviting us to watch him fail. You are certain? I asked. I am, Holmes replied, because he has misjudged his variables. The hospital was placed under discreet surveillance. Doctors and constables mingled with the staff, careful not to disturb the ordinary rhythms of the place. The ward specified in the letter was quiet, filled with the low murmurs and antiseptic smells that characterize such institutions. The patient, a middle-aged man suffering from a heart condition, was informed only that he would be observed closely that night. Holmes insisted upon speaking with him personally. You are safe, Holmes told the man, his voice steady and reassuring. Whatever you may feel or hear, remember that you are surrounded by people who will not abandon you. The man nodded, visibly comforted. Holmes turned to me afterward. Observe the difference, Watson. Reassurance alters the entire experiment. As night fell, we waited. Hours passed. The ward remained quiet. No strange hum manifested. No unexplained sensations swept through the room. The patient slept peacefully, monitored by attentive nurses and physicians. Shortly after midnight, Holmes stirred. He is here, he said softly. I followed his gaze to a shadowed corner of the ward, where a man stood beside a column, apparently absorbed in reading a chart. There was nothing remarkable about him. His clothes were plain, his posture unassuming. Yet Holmes's attention locked upon him with unmistakable intensity. The man sensed it. He looked up, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes met Holmes's. In that instant, I felt the air change. The man turned and walked calmly toward the exit. Holmes was after him at once. I followed, heart pounding, as we pursued the stranger through corridors and down stairwells. He moved quickly, but without panic, as though the chase itself were an expected outcome. We burst out into the cold night air. The man darted down an alley, then another, vanishing and reappearing with infuriating ease. At last, he slipped through a narrow door and slammed it behind him. We found ourselves before a small, unmarked building, a workshop by the look of it. Holmes tested the door. Locked. He has escaped, I said breathlessly. Holmes shook his head. No, he has withdrawn. Inside the workshop, which we entered with the assistance of the police, we found evidence of hurried departure. Notes burned in the grate, apparatus dismantled, tools abandoned. But there was no sign of the man himself. What happened? Lestrade demanded. Holmes surveyed the room with quiet satisfaction. His experiment failed, and failure unsettles him. Indeed, the following days bore out Holmes's assessment. The letters ceased. No new threats appeared. Instead, rumors circulated of a man asking pointed questions in coffee houses about Holmes, about the hospital incident, about whether fear truly could kill under scrutiny. "He is seeking reassurance," Holmes said, "from the world." "And what will he do if he does not find it?" I asked. Holmes's expression darkened. "Then he will attempt to restore his confidence." That attempt came in the form of a most audacious act. A public lecture was announced at the Royal Institution, advertised as a discourse on the limits of human perception. The speaker was listed simply as A. Grant. Holmes studied the notice with grim interest. "He wishes to reclaim the narrative," he said, "and to do so publicly." "You will attend?" I asked. "I must," Holmes replied. "He is inviting confrontation." The lecture hall was crowded on the appointed night, filled with academics, physicians, and curious members of the public. The speaker, a tall, plain man with an unremarkable face, addressed the audience with calm authority. He spoke eloquently of suggestion, expectation, and the power of belief to shape physical reality. As he spoke, I felt a growing unease, not from any overt threat, but from the precision of his words. He was not confessing, yet neither was he concealing. He was explaining himself. Holmes listened intently, his eyes never leaving the speaker. At one point, the man paused and said, "There are those who believe that intellect alone can police the mind. They are mistaken." His gaze flicked briefly toward Holmes. The lecture concluded without incident. The audience applauded. The man stepped down from the podium and vanished into the crowd. Holmes did not move at once. When he did, it was with measured deliberation. "He has shown his hand," Holmes said quietly, "and in doing so, he has overreached." "How?" I asked. "By stepping into the light," Holmes replied. "He believes that ideas protect him, but ideas, once expressed, may be examined." As we left the hall, I sensed that the balance had shifted once more. The uncatchable man had attempted to reassert his mastery through public demonstration. Instead, he had revealed something profoundly human, a need to be understood. And in that need lay the first true crack in his armor. Holmes walked beside me in silence, his face composed but intent. "The experiment failed," he said at last. "And when a man's philosophy fails, Watson, he is capable of anything." I shuddered, knowing instinctively that the most dangerous act was yet to come. Not because it would be subtle, but because it would be desperate. The morning after the lecture, London seemed to exhale a fragile breath. The fog, though still present, appeared thinner, as if uncertainty had been momentarily suspended. Holmes, however, remained deeply engaged, tracing over maps, reports, and the notes he had recovered from the abandoned workshop. His mind, always restless, seemed to dwell not on the immediate events, but upon the subtler currents, the impressions, the whispers, and the nearly invisible trails left by our elusive adversary. "The lecture was revealing, Watson," he said, as we gathered in the sitting room, the gaslight flickering against the walls lined with books and instruments. "Our adversary cannot resist the stage. Even his most calculated plans require recognition." I stirred my tea, considering his words. "But he has not killed anyone recently." "No," Holmes replied. "Not because he lacks the capacity, but because he is testing the terrain. He is probing the edges of our vigilance." Lestrade arrived shortly afterward, bearing a bundle of reports from the Metropolitan Police. The documents described minor disturbances, odd sensations, inexplicable faintings, reports of hums in isolated houses, but nothing fatal. Holmes perused them with characteristic attention, noting the times, locations, and correlations. "You see," he said finally, "he is mapping London as surely as he maps human reaction. Each report is a vertex, each occurrence a vector." "A vector to what?" I asked, somewhat daunted by his terminology. "Power," he said. "The power to induce response without leaving a trace. His crimes are psychological as much as they are physical." Over the following days, Holmes implemented a plan of careful observation. We traversed neighborhoods previously untouched by the murders, monitored lodging houses, workshops, and public spaces, and questioned passers-by with gentle precision. Each movement, each statement, each casual observation was meticulously recorded. Holmes's methodical nature revealed the contours of London in a way I had never appreciated. Its avenues, alleys, and bridges, not merely as geography, but as stages upon which human expectation could be manipulated. It was during one of these excursions that we encountered a peculiar character, an elderly man with sharp eyes, a bent back, and a remarkably steady gait. He seemed to appear wherever we walked, lingering just beyond the periphery of vision. Holmes noticed him immediately. "Observe," Holmes said, nodding subtly. "He is aware of us." "And who is he?" I whispered. "That," Holmes replied, "is the first witness of the labyrinth." We followed the man discreetly as he moved through streets and alleys, observing the way he paused, glanced, and then proceeded. He did not approach us, nor did he speak. Yet there was an undeniable intention in his manner, as though he were confirming the integrity of the network that our adversary had created. Holmes's fascination grew. "He is either a disciple, an observer, or part of the network," he said, "and each possibility is significant." We tailed the man for hours, noting entrances to workshops, basements, and narrow passageways. Finally, he entered a small, nondescript doorway, leaving the rest of the alley empty. Holmes and I waited some moments, then entered with extreme caution. The interior was dark, filled with shelving, boxes, and mechanical devices. There were tools, diagrams, and notes, scattered in a manner that suggested hurried abandonment, but nothing that immediately revealed the identity of our adversary. Yet Holmes's gaze swept the room with the certainty of one who reads invisible lines between objects. "The network is extensive," he murmured. "We are not dealing with a solitary mind, Watson, but with a philosophy disseminated across individuals." "And yet," I said, "the murders themselves are still singular in method." "Yes," Holmes agreed. "Each one reflects the hand of a master. The network is a shadow, a veil, always present, never decisive." We returned to Baker Street late in the afternoon, our minds weighed with new concerns. Holmes spent the evening at his desk, sketching diagrams and annotating maps. I attempted to write in my journal, but found my thoughts continually drawn to the labyrinth he described. A city threaded with fear, suggestion, and carefully placed observers. The next morning, a letter arrived for Holmes. Unlike previous correspondence, it bore no signature, no flourish, only a single line written in an elegant, controlled hand. "You are beginning to see the corridors. Soon we shall meet at the heart." Holmes read it twice, then set it down with deliberate care. "Another invitation," he said, "and a subtle taunt. could see the weight of it upon him, yet there was no fear, only a concentrated attention. "Do you believe he intends to confront you?" I asked. "Not directly," Holmes said. "He wishes to draw us inward. The heart of the labyrinth is not a place, it is an idea. And ideas, once conceived, can shape the behavior of many." He explained further that the killer's confidence stemmed from a profound understanding of human expectation. The crimes were designed not merely to kill, but to manipulate perception, to cause witnesses and victims alike to act in predictable ways. Letters, hums, and subtle interventions were all instruments tuned to exploit belief as much as biology. "The corridor, Watson," he said, "is a metaphor, yes, but a dangerous one, for if one loses sight of the edges, the mind becomes the prison." The day passed with meticulous planning. Holmes instructed me to observe patterns in reports of minor disturbances, to note even trivial deviations in routine, and to map them against the geography of London. By nightfall, our records resembled a complex lattice, threads of observation interwoven with points of consequence. Then, as we prepared for bed, Lestrade arrived in urgent distress. "There's been another incident," he announced. "A young woman named Clara Merton collapsed in her lodging in Whitechapel. The room was locked, and nothing appears disturbed." Holmes did not rise at once. He merely studied the report with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Observe, Watson," he said at last. "Our adversary grows bold. The corridors are narrowing. He seeks to draw us into the center." We departed immediately, racing through streets that seemed to close around us, fog curling in spirals like serpents. At Merton's lodging, we found a scene eerily reminiscent of the earlier murders. The young woman lying unconscious, her face pale, eyes closed, yet no evidence of struggle, no chemical residue, and no mechanical device in sight. Holmes crouched beside her, observing minutely. "No signs of physical intrusion," he murmured. "No marks, no poison detectable. Yet she is compromised." He stood, pacing the narrow room. "He is testing boundaries now, not merely of mortality, but of predictability." A nurse arrived, confirming that Merton had been attended by a physician upon fainting, and that there was no apparent cause. Holmes examined the floor, the window, the door. Then, crouching beside the bed again, he detected the faintest trace of something. A subtle chemical tang, imperceptible to all but the most sensitive sense. "He is evolving his method," Holmes said. "From physical stimulus to environmental suggestion, every element calculated." As we left Whitechapel, I understood that we were not merely investigating murders. We were navigating a conceptual maze, where fear, expectation, and human behavior were the terrain itself. London had become the laboratory, the city streets the corridors, and the uncatchable man, the architect of a psychological architecture whose full scope remained invisible. Holmes's resolve did not waver, yet even I, habituated as I was to his extraordinary acuity, felt a pang of apprehension. The labyrinth had a center, he said, and we were being guided toward it. Whether knowingly or by design, I could not say. But one thing was certain. The battle we were engaged in was no longer about bodies or letters, devices or hums. It was a battle of perception, intellect and control, waged upon the very mind of London itself. The incident in Whitechapel weighed heavily upon us, for though Clara Merton survived the night, she did so in a state of profound shock, her mind seemingly locked away from recollection. The physicians could offer no explanation beyond vague references to nervous collapse. Holmes listened to their conclusions with polite attention, yet I could see that his thoughts were already elsewhere, racing ahead along lines invisible to the rest of us. "She is alive," I said, as we left the lodging house in the grey light of early morning. "Does that not alter the nature of the case?" "It alters nothing," Holmes replied. "It refines it." I waited for him to elaborate, but he remained silent as we walked. The streets of Whitechapel were stirring to life, vendors calling out, children darting between carts, labourers trudging to work. It struck me then how cruelly ordinary the scene was, and how easily terror might nestle within such familiarity. Back at Baker Street, Holmes shut himself away for several hours. When he emerged, his eyes were bright with that particular intensity I had come to associate with imminent revelation, yet he said nothing of conclusions. Instead, he issued instructions. "Watson," he said, "I require you to do something that will test both your patience and your nerve." I braced myself. "I am listening." "You must place yourself," Holmes continued, "in the path of expectation." Seeing my confusion, he clarified. "I intend to make certain information public, carefully chosen, partially true, and deeply misleading." "You propose to deceive the killer?" "No," Holmes replied. "I propose to allow him to deceive himself." The plan, as Holmes revealed it, was audacious. He would allow word to circulate through the press, through medical circles, through the whispering conduits of the city, that Scotland Yard had concluded the recent deaths and collapses were the result of a rare but natural neurological condition exacerbated by stress and rumour. The implication would be that the mystery was dissolving into banality. "And my role?" I asked. "You will act," Holmes said, "as a man who believes the danger has passed." Within 2 days, the narrative took hold. Newspapers printed reassurances. Physicians offered calm explanations. The tone of public discourse softened. Fear did not vanish, but it changed shape, retreating from sharp panic to lingering unease. I played my part, frequenting public places, engaging in casual conversation, even expressing relief at the supposed resolution. It was an uncomfortable performance, for I felt keenly the eyes upon me, whether real or imagined, I could not say. Holmes watched all this with quiet satisfaction. "He will not tolerate this," he said. "To have his work dismissed as hysteria is an insult he cannot endure." The response came, as Holmes predicted, not with another death, but with a message. It was delivered by hand to Baker Street, placed carefully upon our table while we were out, a feat that spoke volumes about the sender's confidence. The note read, "You trivialize what you do not understand. I will not allow my work to be reduced to coincidence." Holmes smiled thinly. "There it is." "What now?" I asked. "Now," Holmes said, "we follow the indignation." He explained that the killer's self-conception was central to his method. He did not see himself as a mere murderer, but as a demonstrator of truth, his truth. To deny him acknowledgement was to provoke him. "He will act," Holmes said, "not to kill, but to prove." That proof came in the form of an announcement printed anonymously in several papers and posted upon public notice boards. A demonstration of cause and effect. Tonight at dusk. No location was specified. The city buzzed with speculation. Some dismissed it as a hoax. Others felt the old fear rekindle. Holmes, however, seemed almost relieved. "He has given us a timetable," he said, "and that betrays urgency." As dusk approached, Holmes directed our attention to a cluster of reports, minor disturbances, sightings, and letters, all converging upon a particular district near the Thames. It was an area of warehouses, abandoned offices, and narrow lanes, half forgotten even by London's standards. "The heart," Holmes said softly, "not geographically, but conceptually, a place of transit, of movement without belonging." We arrived as the light faded, the river looming dark and silent beside us. The area was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of commerce absent. Holmes led me through a warren of passages until we reached a large, disused warehouse. Inside, the space was vast and shadowed. At its center stood a makeshift arrangement of chairs, a lectern, and a curious assembly of devices, some familiar from earlier discoveries, others entirely new. "He means to lecture again," I whispered. "Yes," Holmes replied, "but this time the audience is not the public. It is us." A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man, plainly dressed, his face as unremarkable as ever. He greeted Holmes with a nod, neither hostile nor friendly. "You came," he said. "I was invited," Holmes replied. The man smiled faintly. Few understand the nature of invitation. "What is it you intend to demonstrate?" Holmes asked calmly. "That fear is not the cause," the man said. "It is the medium. The cause is expectation, and expectation can be engineered." He gestured to the devices. "Tonight, I will show you that death is not necessary. Control is sufficient." Before Holmes could respond, the man activated one of the mechanisms. A low vibration filled the air, not loud, but pervasive. At the same time, subtle changes occurred. Lights flickered, shadows shifted. The space seemed to contract. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath shorten. Holmes, however, remained steady. "You are relying on anticipation," Holmes said, "but you have miscalculated." "How so?" the man asked. "You assume," Holmes replied, "that awareness weakens the effect. In fact, it neutralizes it." Holmes stepped forward, speaking calmly, deliberately, explaining the mechanisms, the psychology, the tricks of perception. As he spoke, I felt the tension ease, the vibration lose its hold. The man's expression faltered. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. "You see," Holmes continued, "your method requires ignorance. Once the process is exposed, expectation collapses." The man shook his head. "No, there will always be those who believe." "Yes," Holmes agreed, "but belief without isolation is powerless." Police whistles sounded in the distance. The man glanced toward the exits, calculating. "This is not the end," he said. "No," Holmes replied. "It is the beginning of consequence." The man fled into the maze of passages beyond the warehouse. Holmes made no move to pursue him. "You let him go?" I exclaimed. "For now," Holmes said. "He is no longer uncatchable. He is merely uncontained." As we emerged into the night air, I felt a curious mixture of relief and dread. The confrontation had revealed much, yet resolved little. The killer's philosophy had been challenged, but not destroyed. Holmes gazed out over the river, his expression thoughtful. "He will try again," he said. "But next time, he will abandon subtlety." "And you?" I asked. Holmes turned to me, his eyes sharp and resolute. "Next time," he said, "I shall be ready to end it." I believed him. Yet even as I did, I could not escape the feeling that the contest had entered its most perilous stage. The center of the labyrinth had been reached, but the exit, if one existed at all, remained hidden, waiting for a final, irrevocable choice. The aftermath of the confrontation by the Thames left London in a peculiar state of suspension. News of the mysterious demonstrations spread rapidly, though stripped of its more unsettling details by official discretion. The police spoke of trespass, of illegal apparatus, of a fugitive sought for questioning. The newspapers, deprived of sensation, resorted to conjecture. Yet beneath the surface of civic normality, something had altered. The certainty of fear had been broken, but not dispelled. In its place lay a brittle calm, prone to shatter at the slightest provocation. Holmes sensed this at once. "You see, Watson," he said on the morning after as we sat over breakfast, "fear, once challenged, does not vanish. It fragments." "And fragmentation is dangerous?" I asked. "Exceedingly," Holmes replied. "A unified terror can be studied, predicted, even diffused. Fragmented fear becomes erratic." He had slept little. I could see it in the pallor of his face and the sharpness of his movements. Yet his mind was as keen as ever, perhaps keener, honed by the encounter with an adversary who had dared to intellectualize murder. "The man we face," Holmes continued, "has lost something vital." "His confidence," I suggested. "No. His illusion of inevitability," Holmes corrected. "He has been contradicted, publicly and privately. That breeds desperation." The proof of this assertion arrived before noon. Lestrade burst into Baker Street with an urgency that brooked no delay. "We have another incident," he said. "Not a death. Worse." He explained that at a boarding school in Hampstead, several boys had been seized by sudden panic during a lesson. One fainted, another suffered a violent fit, and a third attempted to leap from a window, convinced the room was closing in upon him. No external cause had been identified. No strange devices were found. No letters preceded the incident. "This is different," Lestrade said grimly. "Children." Holmes's jaw tightened. "He is escalating," he said. "Not in lethality, but in audacity." We travelled at once to Hampstead. The school stood upon a rise overlooking the city, its brick facade respectable and reassuring. Inside, however, the atmosphere was one of barely contained hysteria. Masters spoke in hushed tones. Boys clustered nervously, glancing at walls and ceilings as though expecting them to move. Holmes questioned the affected boys gently. Their accounts were confused, but shared a common thread. A sudden sense of suffocation, a conviction that something unseen was pressing inward. "No sound?" Holmes asked. "No, sir," one boy replied. "Just a feeling." Holmes examined the classroom with meticulous care. He tapped walls, inspected vents, sniffed the air. At last, he straightened. "There is nothing here," he said, "and that is the point." "You mean?" I began. "He no longer needs a trigger," Holmes said. "He is relying on suggestion alone." Lestrade frowned. "Then how do we stop him?" "By understanding what he has lost," Holmes replied. On the journey back to Baker Street, Holmes spoke at length, more openly than I had heard him do throughout the case. He believed himself an architect of certainty, Holmes said. He thought that by mastering expectation, he could master outcome. But our encounter disrupted that belief. Now he seeks to prove, to himself, more than to us, that his control remains absolute. "And the children?" I asked. "A demonstration of reach," Holmes said bitterly. He wants to show that no space is immune. That evening, Holmes received another letter. It was shorter than the last, the handwriting less carefully restrained. You interfered. Now observe the consequences. Holmes read it in silence, then handed it to me. I could not help but note the subtle tremor in the strokes, the first sign of haste, perhaps even agitation. He is unraveling, Holmes said softly, which makes him unpredictable. Holmes altered his strategy. No longer content with observation and counter-narrative, he resolved to force a conclusion, not by pursuit, but by constriction. We must deny him anonymity, Holmes said, not by naming him, but by limiting his freedom to act unseen. He advised Lestrade to increase visible police presence, not in response to incidents, but preemptively, at schools, markets, lodging houses. He encouraged public lectures by physicians and psychologists, openly discussing the effects of suggestion and fear, demystifying them. Knowledge is not merely power, Holmes said. It is insulation. The response was immediate. Reports of disturbances declined. Panic attacks still occurred, but with less intensity. People spoke of them openly, comparing experiences, grounding one another in shared reality. The killer, deprived of his medium, grew bolder. 2 nights later, Holmes and I were awakened by a commotion in Baker Street. A crowd had gathered outside, murmuring excitedly. Holmes descended at once. Upon the pavement, written in chalk upon the stones, was a message. You cannot police thought. Holmes studied it calmly. No, he said, but one can trace the hand that writes. He knelt, examining the chalk marks, the pressure, the angle. He wanted me to see this, Holmes said, which means he was here. And you believe, I began. Yes, Holmes said. He is drawing closer. That night, Holmes did something I had never seen him do before. He armed himself, not with a revolver, but with a simple truncheon. This will not end in a drawing room, he said, nor in a courtroom argument alone. Over the next days, Holmes deliberately made himself visible. He walked the same routes at predictable hours, attended public functions, allowed himself to be seen alone. I protested, but he was resolute. He must believe he can reach me, Holmes said. Otherwise, he will continue to strike indirectly. The bait was irresistible. On the 5th evening of this campaign, as Holmes returned alone from a lecture, he was followed. He knew it, of course, and led his pursuer through a labyrinth of streets near the river, the same conceptual territory where the killer had once staged his demonstration. Holmes later recounted the encounter to me with characteristic clarity. He confronted me at last, Holmes said, not with a device, but with words. The man emerged from the shadows, his face pale, eyes fever-bright. You are destroying my work, he said. No, Holmes replied. You are destroying it yourself. You think you have won, the man said, but fear will always return. Yes, Holmes said, but not under your command. The man lunged, not with a weapon, but with desperate fury. Holmes, prepared, struck him down. The police arrived moments later, summoned by Holmes's signal. The man did not resist arrest. As they led him away, he laughed softly. You cannot undo what I have shown them, he said. Holmes watched him go, his expression unreadable. He is right, in part, Holmes said to me afterward. The knowledge remains, but knowledge without a conductor is harmless. As the city settled once more into uneasy peace, I reflected upon the ordeal we had endured. The killer had sought to demonstrate the ultimate vulnerability of the human mind. Holmes had countered by exposing not only the method, but the man behind it, stripping away the illusion of omnipotence. Yet even as the case drew toward resolution, I sensed that its implications would linger. The fractures in certainty, once revealed, could never be wholly repaired. Holmes stood by the window, gazing out at the lamps of Baker Street. "The most dangerous illusions," he said quietly, "are those that contain a measure of truth." And in that moment, I understood that though the uncatchable man had been caught at last, the shadow he cast upon London would endure, not as fear, but as a sober reminder of how fragile the line between thought and reality can be. The man's arrest did not bring the immediate sense of closure that one might expect. On the contrary, it introduced a new and unsettling phase to the affair. For once, the uncatchable man was deprived of his freedom. He seemed only too eager to replace action with explanation. Scotland Yard, uncertain how best to proceed, allowed Holmes a degree of access that was highly irregular, yet entirely justified by the peculiar nature of the crimes. The prisoner gave his name as Adrian Calder, not Grant, nor any of the other aliases we had traced, but a name supported by documents of impeccable authenticity. He was, by profession, a lecturer of sorts, having held short-term appointments in various institutions under different guises. His education was formidable: medicine, physics, psychology, acoustics. A generalist, but a dangerously focused one. "He is precisely what we expected," Holmes remarked to me after reviewing the initial reports. "A man who believes breadth excuses amorality." Calder requested, specifically, to speak with Holmes. "He will say nothing of value," Lestrade warned. "Only philosophy and provocation." "Nevertheless," Holmes replied, "we shall listen. Men like Calder betray themselves not through facts, but through assumptions." We were ushered into a stark interview room beneath the yard, its stone walls damp with age. Calder sat at the table, hands folded, his expression composed to the point of eeriness. He smiled when Holmes entered. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "at last, a civil conversation." Holmes seated himself opposite without returning the smile. I took my place slightly behind him, notebook in hand. "You wished to speak," Holmes said calmly. "Yes," Calder replied, "to understand." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You have spent considerable effort demonstrating that you understand human nature exceedingly well." Calder's smile widened. "Only its weaknesses." "And yet," Holmes said, "you miscalculated." Calder leaned back. "Did I? I was caught, yes, but caught is not the same as disproved." Holmes said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch. Calder filled it eagerly. "You believe you neutralized my work by exposing it," Calder continued, "by turning mystery into mechanism. But tell me, have panic attacks ceased? Has fear vanished from London?" "No," Holmes replied evenly. "Exactly," Calder said. "I revealed a truth. You merely interrupted a demonstration." Holmes regarded him steadily. "You revealed nothing that was not already known to serious students of the mind." Calder laughed softly. "Knowledge unused is impotence. I applied it." "And in doing so," Holmes said, "you proved something else entirely." Calder tilted his head. "Which is?" "That you required control more than truth," Holmes said. "You did not seek to enlighten. You sought to dominate." For the first time, Calder's composure faltered, only slightly, but enough. "You mistake me," he said. I sought inevitability, to show that once expectation is shaped, outcome follows. And yet, Holmes replied, here you sit. Calder's eyes hardened. Because you interfered. No, Holmes corrected. Because you interfered too much. Holmes leaned forward. You wrote letters when silence would have sufficed. You placed devices when suggestion alone might have worked. You lectured, you demonstrated, you taunted. Each act revealed need. Need for recognition, for validation, for an audience. Calder said nothing. You told yourself that anonymity was your shield. Holmes continued. But anonymity is a lonely thing. Eventually one seeks a mirror. Calder's fingers tightened against the tabletop. You think me a criminal, Calder said quietly. I think myself an anatomist. Holmes shook his head. An anatomist dissects what is dead. You experimented upon the living. And society experiments upon them daily, Calder snapped. I merely made the process explicit. Holmes rose. This interview is concluded, he said. Calder laughed again, but the sound was strained. You may imprison me, Mr. Holmes, but you cannot unteach what I have taught the city. Holmes paused at the door. No, he said, but I can contextualize it. Outside, the damp air of the corridor felt almost bracing. I realized only then how tense I had been throughout the exchange. You baited him, I said. I allowed him to speak, Holmes replied. He required no encouragement. In the days that followed, Holmes devoted himself to ensuring that Calder's methods were thoroughly documented, not sensationalized, but explained with sober clarity. He worked with physicians, educators, and officials to produce reports that stripped the crimes of mystique, situating them firmly within known psychological phenomena. Once named, Holmes said, a terror loses much of its power. Yet not all were satisfied. Rumors persisted, exaggerated tales flourished, and some insisted that Calder had been merely one practitioner among many. Do you fear imitators? I asked Holmes one evening. Imitators are inevitable, Holmes replied. But imitation without comprehension is harmless. Calder succeeded because he understood not only fear, but restraint. Those who follow him will lack both. Even so, Holmes remained vigilant. He reviewed every new report of unexplained panic, every letter, every rumor. Gradually, however, a pattern emerged, not of escalation, but of dissipation. Fear, once deprived of a conductor, dispersed. Calder's trial was set for the spring. He showed no remorse, no regret. When asked why he had chosen his victims, he replied simply, they were receptive. Holmes attended the trial briefly, then declined further involvement. My work is finished, he said. Do you truly believe that? I asked. Holmes considered. With Calder, yes. With the idea he embodied, no. That night, as we sat once more in the familiar sitting room at Baker Street, I felt a curious sense of return, as though the city itself had exhaled after a prolonged strain. And yet, I said, this case differs from the others. In what way? Holmes asked. It leaves no single lesson, I replied. Only questions. Holmes smiled faintly. Then it has done its work. He turned to the fire, gazing into its chiffon depths. The most elusive criminals, he said softly, are those who convince themselves they are necessary. I watched him in silence, aware that we stood upon the threshold of resolution, yet not quite beyond it. The uncatchable man had been unmasked, his philosophy exposed, his methods dismantled. But the world he had exploited remained unchanged. And perhaps that was the most unsettling truth of all. Outside, London moved on. streets filling, lamps glowing, voices rising in the night. The labyrinth still existed, but its architect had been removed. Whether another might one day attempt to rebuild it was a question neither Holmes nor I could yet answer. In the weeks that followed Calder's trial, London resumed its customary rhythms with an almost defiant vigour. Markets filled, theatres reopened to packed houses, and the press, having exhausted its appetite for psychological menace, turned once more to politics, scandals, and the quotidian tragedies that are the lifeblood of newspapers. To the casual observer, it might have appeared that the affair of the uncatchable man had been neatly concluded, filed away among the more curious criminal episodes of the age. Yet, to those who had lived through it more closely, the resolution was anything but simple. Holmes, though outwardly returned to his customary habits, was changed in subtle ways that only an intimate observer might notice. He played his violin more often, favouring slower, more contemplative pieces. He read less sensational literature, devoting himself instead to philosophy and works on moral reasoning. His moods, once sharply alternating between languor and fierce concentration, settled into a steadier, more deliberate cadence. "You are unusually reflective," I remarked one evening as he drew the bow across the strings with restrained precision. Holmes did not look up. "Reflection is the price of understanding," he said. "And understanding, Watson, is rarely comfortable." The trial itself had been a strange affair. Calder conducted his own defense for much of it, speaking with icy eloquence about human susceptibility, about the inevitability of panic in uncertain environments, about society's unwillingness to confront the true mechanisms of fear. The prosecution, wisely advised by Holmes, avoided theatrical rebuttals. Instead, they dismantled Calder's claims piece by piece, grounding them in established science, exposing the deliberate manipulations, the calculated intrusions, the carefully staged environments. What ultimately swayed the jury was not outrage, but clarity. Calder was convicted, not as a philosopher misunderstood, but as a criminal who had knowingly engineered harm. His sentence was severe, yet appropriate. As he was led from the courtroom, he cast one last glance toward Holmes, a look not of hatred, but of something perilously close to admiration. "I almost succeeded," he said quietly as they passed. Holmes met his gaze without flinching. "You almost understood," he replied. After that, Holmes declined all further involvement. He did not write an account, nor did he permit me to publish one immediately. "Not yet," he said. "The city must forget the thrill before it can learn the lesson." It was only months later, when the memory had softened into something less volatile, that he gave his consent for me to set down the facts as I had observed them. And yet, even as I wrote, I found myself troubled by a persistent unease, not fear, but a thoughtful disquiet. For Calder's crimes, once stripped of their mystery, revealed something profoundly unsettling. Not that the mind could be manipulated, but that such manipulation required so little force. I voiced this concern to Holmes one rainy afternoon as we watched the familiar procession of Baker Street pass beneath our window. "You are troubled by the implication," Holmes said, without prompting. "Yes," I admitted, "that the barrier between stability and collapse is thinner than we like to believe." Holmes nodded. "It has always been thin, Watson. Calder merely illuminated it." "And you?" I asked. "Are you immune?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Immunity is a myth. Awareness is the best we can hope for." He rose and crossed the room, pausing before the window. Calder believed himself uncatchable because he misunderstood the nature of invisibility, Holmes continued. He thought that by operating within the mind, he could avoid consequence. But the mind is not a void. It is a network of language, culture, expectation. Interfere with it long enough, and patterns emerge. Patterns that you can follow, I said. Patterns that anyone trained to observe may follow, Holmes corrected gently. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson announced a visitor, a young man, nervous but determined, who sought Holmes's advice regarding a supposed series of unexplained faintings at his place of employment. Holmes listened patiently, asked a few precise questions, and then reassured the fellow with calm authority. "Anxiety spreads more quickly than illness," Holmes told him. "Rest, routine, and honest discussion will resolve it." The man departed, visibly relieved. "You see," Holmes said, turning to me, "the antidote is seldom dramatic." As winter deepened, the case receded further into memory. Yet from time to time, echoes surfaced. An article speculating on mass hysteria, a lecture on suggestion, a whispered rumor that died quickly for lack of substance. Each time, Holmes noted it, assessed it, and dismissed it without alarm. "The echo remains," he said once, "but echoes diminish unless fed." It was on a quiet evening, nearly a year after Calder's arrest, that Holmes spoke of the case one final time. "Watson," he said, "do you know why this affair troubled me more than most?" I waited. "Because Calder was not entirely wrong," Holmes said. "He erred not in his understanding of fear, but in his conclusion about it." "And what was that?" I asked. "He believed fear proved the absence of order," Holmes replied. "In truth, it proves the necessity of it." He returned to his chair, his expression thoughtful. "The mind seeks patterns, explanations, anchors. When deprived of them, it invents monsters. Calder sought to become one of those monsters. I sought only to remind the city that monsters are always human, and therefore limited." I closed my notebook, sensing that no further words were required. Outside, the lamps of Baker Street glowed steadily, indifferent to philosophy, crime, or fear. Carriages passed, voices rose and fell. Life continued with stubborn persistence. The killer who could not be caught had been caught, not merely in body, but in thought. His greatest illusion, that of untouchable influence, had been dispelled by something far less sensational than terror. Understanding, shared and patiently applied. As I set down these final lines, I do so not to sensationalize the case, but to preserve its true lesson. For while crimes may change in method and motive, the human mind remains constant in its strengths and vulnerabilities. And as long as there are those who would seek to exploit that vulnerability, there will be need for minds like Sherlock Holmes's, not to conquer fear, but to illuminate it, until what once seemed invisible stands revealed, finite and accountable in the clear light of reason.